Welcome back to Proxy, everybody, and today we're going to be diving in to secondary scoring units, talking about how cheap is too cheap, and just in general speaking to the balance of Warhammer 40k's secondary scoring units. So as you know, secondary scoring is a huge part of the game. It's almost half your total victory points, and it can make or break you on the battlefield. Your ability to score secondaries on a regular basis and get up to that 40-point cap is going to determine whether you win oftentimes or lose. Now, as Eldar players and as perhaps Drukhari players that are watching this video, we have a relatively easy time scoring secondaries most of the time because we have units that are highly mobile. But mobility isn't the only factor when talking about these secondary units, and in fact, almost every army in the 40k universe, or this game per se, has some pretty good selections when it comes to secondary scoring units, and in general, I actually think it's one of the most balanced parts of the game. That was until I came across the new Astra Militarum Krieg Combat Engineers. Now, a lot of you guys at this point are thinking, well, Proxy Hammer, of course they're going to be nerfed, they're going to get more expensive, whatever, right? And that's true. They probably are going to get more expensive. Obviously, 35 points is not going to be the cost that they end up being in the, MFM, right? The Munitorum Field Manual. That's not going to be what they cost, obviously. However, I would argue that even at 65 points, right, which is a more reasonable cost for that unit, they're looking to be one of those meta-defining units, and I'm going to talk about why later in this video. But it really got me thinking about balance when it came to secondary scoring units and what you should expect from your secondary scorers, what they're good at, and what you need to look for when selecting those units and those specialists. So without further ado, let us go ahead and dive right into the video and analyze the secondary scoring specialists that are critical to winning us games of 40k. So let's do a quick overview before we dive into the video proper. We are going to be discussing the role that secondary specialists play on the battlefield. First and foremost, just give everybody a kind of a rundown on what they're supposed to achieve. We're going to be looking at the factors that go into assessing the cost of secondary specialists and what they must have in order to be effective. We're going to be talking about some quick comparisons of secondary specialists from other armies. And lastly, what secondary specialists across the game should cost at a baseline level and the justification for that cost, which I believe is pretty much set in stone up until, a couple of days ago when we found out what the combat engineers can do. So the role that they play on the battlefield is pretty simple. Their goal is to score secondary victory points for you through action or board placement secondary objectives. Things like behind enemy lines, or cleanse, or containment, or sabotage, right? There's a lot of action secondaries in there, and secondary specialists are the best at it. And that's simply because they're usually very fast, and they're usually pretty expendable. And we'll get into why later in this video. Now, secondary specialists also perform other tasks because they are so cheap, usually. They can also perform screening duties, and they can skirmish to draw out your opponent's more expensive units. It's a tactic called trading up, right? You put a unit out into a position that your opponent cannot ignore, whether it be a cheap unit or a reasonably more expensive one, and then the hope is that your opponent has to bring out a more expensive unit to deal with that cheap unit, and you can then hit that more expensive unit harder and thus make a good trade. Now, typically speaking, because secondary specialists have this kind of almost sacrificial role, they don't usually survive past turn 2. In my experiences, the units that are secondary specialists that I use to push up the board on turn 1 and turn 2 are going to die. And that's just part of what they do, right? They score you victory points, they screen for you, they set up the battlefield, they dictate when and where the fighting is going to happen, usually, hopefully at least, in your favor, and then they die. But secondary specialists allow you to also score points which would otherwise be unattainable from your other units. So because of their various abilities, because of their mobility, their relative durability in the early stages of the game when fighting against smaller units, usually of infantry, they're going to be able to score you points that the rest of your army would be unable to score. So not having secondary specialists in your army is a huge disadvantage. And a lot of times what you'll find is that armies that rely purely on damage end up really sacrificing a lot of their secondary victory point score because of it, right? There's going to be some stuff that without proper planning and without proper placement, your army is just not going to be able to score on turn one. Now, of course, there are strategies that some armies use in order to get around this, or perhaps even, use CP to draw other secondaries that are not maybe action-based, or, there may be things that a more small, more elite army can do more easily, like things like Marked for Death, or, Bring It Down, or Assassination, things of that nature. But typically speaking, you're going to need secondary specialists to score you points, right? So that's the role of the secondary specialist in a nutshell. Now, as for our secondary specialists, what factors go into assessing the cost of them, and what do they have to have in order to be effective? So first of all, in my personal experience, secondary specialists are usually responsible for at least 25% of your secondary VP during the first few turns of the game. So turns 1, turns 2, they're scoring you around 10 points on average, sometimes more if you draw well, in your secondary victory points, which in turn, by the way, is about 10% of your total score. You have 90 points to score total, you have 50 primary victory points and 40 secondaries, so scoring about 10 VP in your first couple of turns is about 10% of your total score. And they achieve this by having a combination of speed, deployment abilities like Scout, Infiltrate, Redeployment, or Deep Strike, and at times, reasonable survivability, so things like stealth, decent armor and toughness, reactive moves, etc. Again, in the early stages of the game, they're going to be going up against other skirmishing elements typically, and they're not going to have to worry too much about your opponent's heavy hitters coming out early. And if your opponent's heavy hitters do come out early, then you can strike back really hard, and usually you can cripple the enemy's army by turn 2. At least in my experience playing the Eldar. Could be a little bit different for other armies. But, in general, what are Rangers going up against early game? What are Mandrakes going up against early game? Well, they're going up against other infantry typically, unless they go deep and try to score some secondaries on things like Line Breaker or, a deep sabotage or something like that. And to be effective, these units must have, and it's an absolute must, they must have a combination of the above characteristics and abilities while maintaining a lowish, quote-unquote, sacrificial cost. And what I define as a sacrificial cost is anywhere between 50 points and about 90 points. 90 points is on the high end. You typically don't sacrifice those units, but sometimes there are cases where you will sacrifice those units. A great example of this is Shining Spears. That's why I put the image of them in the background. Shining Spears are 90 points. At 100 points, at 120 points, which they were previously in the edition, they weren't sacrificial at all. And now they're at that level where they can actually decently perform secondary objectives because they have a combination of speed, and they also have a combination of durability, right? They have a -1 to hit built in, so it's an uber stealth kind of, and they have a decent armor, decent toughness, decent saves, and in general they can survive to score some secondary objectives like sabotage. So I would actually consider Shining Spears a dual role unit that can kind of go into secondaries a little bit as well. And there are other armies that have units like this. So it's not just the really cheap that makes a secondary specialist. It is sometimes a unit that is a little bit more durable, a little bit more expensive, that takes a little bit more tact to actually play effectively, but can be very worth it. In general, though, you're looking at units around maybe 60 to 80 points, right? Something in the range of a scout squad, stealth battle suits, or mandrakes, something of that nature. Now, while it is a factor in cost as well to the unit, damage dealing is not what gives them their value. So, for example, Shining Spears do decent damage. As a secondary specialist, that's not their primary goal, right? That's a secondary goal that they will do in case they have no primary goal or they're not in a position to score a secondary that turn. So, for example, let's say on your first turn you draw Assassination and you draw something like Marked for Death, or not Marked for Death. Bring It Down, right? Unless you discard one of those cards, Shining Spears are typically not going to be able to assassinate something unless your opponent misplays, and they're typically not going to be able to kill a vehicle. So in that case, you're just not going to be able to score. And, you may be able to get some damage off, but you're not going to be able to kill them. So typically speaking, when you're talking about secondary objectives, their ability to deal damage is not what you want them for. You want them for their ability to score those tactical objectives. Okay, so let's kind of go into the specifics and talk about some quick comparisons of secondary specialists from other armies. And basically, if your units are kind of like these units here, then they are secondary specialists, and you should consider them as part of that group. So when you're building your army list, you want at minimum 2 of these units. More realistically, you probably want about 4 of them in general. And that's just, it depends on your army comp. But for me, an Eldar player, I like to have at least 4 secondary objective scoring units, if not a tiny bit more. And I'll talk about why a little later as well. So we have Mandrakes, Rangers, the Scout Squad for Space Marines, and Krieg Combat Engineers. Of course, every single army in the game has at least 1 or 2 of these units. So, Mandrakes, let's talk about them first. I've been playing a lot of Dark Eldar lately. Mandrakes are probably one of the better secondary objective scorers in the game. They do have Infiltrate and are pretty fast, so they do have Movement 8, which means that after an infiltration move, with an advance roll of at least a 2, sometimes even a 1 will get you there, they can get in the enemy deployment zone to score on secondaries like behind enemy lines. I've been saying line breaker, by the way. I'm just confused sometimes with the terminology because I've been playing so many editions, but it's essentially the same thing. Get a unit to your opponent's deployment zone and you score points. They have movement 8, so that means a roll of a 1 on an advance roll will still get you there in most cases. Unless your opponent is very good at screening and totally screens you out, which is a possibility because these guys don't have fly. They can also redeploy back into Strategic Reserve. They essentially have the Swooping Hawk Sky Leap ability, where at the end of your opponent's turn, you can bring them off the board and put them in essentially Strat Reserve. And then Mandrake specifically can Deep Strike, quote-unquote Deep Strike, back on the battlefield, be placed anywhere outside of 9 inches, which gives them a lot of versatility in what objectives they can score. So if you need them on the other side of the board for containment, for example, then you can do that. If you need to drop them in a piece of terrain for sabotage, then you can do that. If your opponent leaves a spot open in the backfield and you want to score line breaker, behind enemy lines, whatever, you can do that, right? So that's very effective at making this a good secondary specialist. They also have stealth and an invulnerable save of 5+. Now, stealth and the invul save are not going to help this unit against Overwatch with flamers or anything like that because they are still toughness 3, they aren't very durable, but stealth will help against things like bolters. So recently, it's not going to help you against things like intercessors because they now have an obscene amount of shots that are coming out of them, but it still will help you survive against other units like scouts, right? Scouts, they don't have that much firepower, and if your Mandrake unit can survive an overwatch from something like scouts, then they can successfully score a secondary objective. Or, if they can survive a turn of shooting from scouts, maybe that use their scout move to get an angle on you, if they can at least have one or two models left in the unit and score a secondary objective next turn, then that's exactly where you want them to be. Now, Mandrakes do have mediocre damage, but it can be boosted with pain tokens. So I think that's of note, because even though this is not their primary objective, if you give them a pain token, they're re-rolling their hit rolls. They do have dev wounds on their ranged weapons, so they do get 10 attacks, 2 attacks apiece at range. With dev wounds, you can spike and kill something important sometimes, or deal some pretty decent chip damage to a lot of targets. So even though their damage isn't great, it's not the reason you take them. Their damage is kind of factored in, and they have decent melee stats as well with strength 5 and 3 attacks apiece on charge. So they can also, if you don't draw a good secondary that turn that they can score, for whatever reason, like I said, you score, maybe you draw assassination and bring it down, you can at least kill some scouts, right? These guys are decent at trading with other skirmishing units. Now, the cost of a 5-man unit is 70 points. It did go up from 65, which I did think 65 was a little bit too cheap for these guys. 70 points, I think, is reasonable for what you get. It's a unit that can score on a lot of different objectives on turn 1. Basically, it can score any secondary objective that's not a kill objective because of the fact that they have infiltrate and a fast movement value. Unless your opponent really does screen them out effectively, which does kind of require your opponent to guess what you're going to do with your Mandrakes. And it can be a little tricky because, of course, if you don't draw that secondary that your opponent guessed you would draw, then your opponent could very easily be out of position. So usually your opponent's not going to just want to waste something turn 1 and hope that they go first. It's typically not something a good opponent is going to plan for. But it can happen. There are situations where your opponent can set up an Overwatch unit in a place and Mandrakes are not going to be able to get there. So I think for a unit that is really fragile, but can survive against some light skirmishing fire long enough to score you some points on secondaries, I think 70 points is reasonable. Let's talk about Rangers next. Rangers are the Eldari version of Mandrakes, essentially. They do have infiltrate, and they have above average movement at 7. Now, this isn't quite as good as 8, because a roll of a 1 on an advanced roll will kind of doom you, but the Eldari have fate dice for now, which means that they could just plug in a 2, and they can auto, get behind enemy lines. So that's not that big of a deal. They also have a D6 reactive move when enemies move within 9. This makes them a great screening unit. So Mandrakes are a good screening unit, but they're not the best at screening. I would say Rangers are much better. And they also do come with stealth and an invulnerable save of 5+, so they have the same durability as Mandrakes in that way. They are slightly more durable against AP0 weapons because they also do have an armor save of 5+, which can be improved to 4+ in cover. However, when it comes to their damage, they are much weaker than Mandrakes. They don't have as strong of a melee attack, and their range profiles aren't as strong as well, but they do have precision, so they do have a bit of utility at that point. They can maybe put a couple wounds on a character if you actually get line of sight on turn 1, and you actually do get turn 1, which is kind of funny, but it's nothing to write home about, and it's definitely not something included in their cost. They do cost 55 points as well, which is on the lower end of secondary specialists. It's very affordable. It makes it super easy for them to screen, to be sacrificed, to bring out more expensive enemy units. And then, of course, the Eldari are really good at picking those units off because we have some of the best damage dealers in the entire game for the points. So, Rangers are a great secondary specialist. And even though we do have other secondary specialists like Warp Spiders and Swooping Hawks, I actually do think those units, because they're more expensive, are a little bit obviously less expendable. So you don't want to just be throwing a Swooping Hawk unit out to score 2 victory points when you could be kind of saving them for a really important screen later on in the game, or you can use them in another way. And, in general, a unit of Rangers, you can sacrifice scoring 2 VP or 3 VP on the first turn, and sometimes you don't want to do that with Swooping Hawks. It is kind of feels bad when you score 3 victory points for Swooping Hawks and then they immediately die, right? You definitely want to be able to both score with Swooping Hawk units and keep them alive. Okay, let's kind of move away from the Eldari and talk about other armies, you know, secondary specialists. So let's talk about the Scout Squad. The Scout Squad is probably one of the most versatile secondary specialist units. And of course, Marines are the most versatile army in the game. So, of course, it's going to belong to them. They do have Infiltrate and Scout 6, which allows them to get up the board in a number of ways. Now, Infiltrate and Scout 6 kind of seems OP. You're like, wait a second, they have both? Isn't that super strong? It is strong, but not in the way you think. It's not going to be able to get them closer to your deployment zone because they still have to be outside of 9 inches. So remember, they do still have to be outside of 9 inches there of enemy units with that scout move. So you can't just get super close. But it is pretty good because it allows them to react to whoever gets first turn. They can also redeploy into strategic reserves if no enemies are within 6 inches. So that's a really good ability as well. So you're combining the ability of Infiltrate, of the Mandrakes, Scouts, and also they have a lesser version of the Mandrake ability, which, is still really good, especially if your opponent gets a first turn and is unable to move a unit within 6 inches. They do also have really good durability with 2 wounds each, toughness 4, and a 4+ save, so they are very resilient against flamer Overwatch. So anything with just regular flamers, they're pretty good at surviving against. Even heavy flamers are going to have a tough time killing all 5 of these boys. They do also have solid damage with the sniper rifle and the heavy bolter or missile launcher that they come with, and they have decent melee too. 3 attacks apiece, strength 4, AP -1 on their combat knives is nothing to scoff at. Now, as for their cost, they do cost 70 points, which is a really good price for what you get with them. They are a little bit slower at movement 6 than things like Mandrakes, but when you combine the Infiltrate and Scout, if your opponent doesn't plan it out, these guys can just as easily score on things like behind enemy lines. So, again, a really good unit. I think the only thing that really brings these guys down is they don't have stealth, so they're pretty easy to hit, and there's a lot of weapons out there nowadays that can do 2 wounds, right? There's a lot of 2 damage weapons out there that can pretty easily kill scouts, and I think that's their kind of weakness. They're not very fast, they don't have fly, so sometimes it's hard to move them from place to place, so you really do have to plan where they're going to go before the game starts. But they are a fantastic unit, and they're probably one of the best secondary specialists in the game. Now, lastly, I want to talk about the Krieg Combat Engineers. Obviously, other armies have their secondary specialists too. For orcs, you have commandos, which act, a lot like scout marines, essentially, just the orky version. You have stealth battle suits, which are just kind of like, infiltrating rangers a little bit. They have a little bit more range damage. They have a little bit more utility, but they're also more expensive. And then you have the Krieg Combat Engineers, which is the new Guard secondary specialist. Now, Guard used to have a couple of units in the index that were secondary specialists. Catachans were a really good secondary specialist. And also they had things like Scout Sentinels, which could, move up, score a secondary objective pretty easily, and provide some good firepower for the durability that they brought to the table. But I'm going to tell you right now, these guys are probably the most broken secondary specialist in the game, even if they get increased in points. And I'm going to kind of go into why. Now, first of all, they do have Scout 6. They don't have Infiltrate, but they do have access to bonus movement via order. So if they do get first turn, they can move up 9 inches with move, move, move. They can also advance roll into your enemy deployment zone if you are able to roll at least halfway decent. And, you do have to combine that with the move, move, move order and the Scout 6, but they can get there. They also have pretty good durability with a 4+ save, which can be increased up to a 2+ save with orders and detachment bonuses. If they are in cover in the recon detachment, they're going to also just get a 2+ save without the order, and if they're in any other detachment, they can be given the take cover order, and they can be given a 2+ save that way. Because I'm pretty sure the order remained the same. But correct me if I'm wrong in the comments, it may just be in the recon detachment that they get a 2-up save, but even a 3-up save is really good. They also, and just to be clear, I don't think the 2-up save is what makes them broken. I think that's kind of cool. I think it's cool that they can like dig in and they're combat engineers, so they can like really kind of dig into their environment and survive, to weather the storm. That's okay, right? Especially because they're Kriegsmen. They're used to fighting in the trenches. But I would say that their high mortal wound damage with the free grenade strat that they get and the remote mine is what makes them OP. This will deal about 6 to 8 mortal wounds in addition to their regular and special weapons. They can take a flamer. Every guy in there gets a combat shotgun, which is not like your regular guard combat shotgun because it's strength 4 assault and 2 shots apiece, which doesn't seem like a big deal, but it's the same as the scout combat shotgun. I think it just has a little bit less range, but that could be, I could be a little bit mistaken on that. Maybe the range is still 18. That's really powerful. The unit has an overwatch capability against other secondary specialists. It has good damage against other secondary specialists, especially with orders. It can deal 6 to 8 mortal wounds, which basically can kill any any amount of 5 wound units. Can kill swooping hawks, it can kill rangers, it can kill mandrakes, and on the upper damage levels it can probably kill a unit of 5 scouts, which is kind of insane if you think about it, right? So this is really powerful. Now, it also can deal these mortal wounds to pretty much any target. Vehicles, monsters, you name it. It can deal damage to it. Now, currently, they're printed at 35 points, and I think obviously this is almost like a joke, right? This is like way back in the day in 5th edition when the Blood Angels Codex came out and everyone found out that rhinos were free. Right? And Razorbacks were 35 points. That's almost as bad. They will no doubt be increased in points very quickly. I'm thinking 65 points initially, and I'm thinking they'll probably get nerfed harder as the edition goes on and as we see them top tournaments. Because the Imperial Guard are looking pretty good. I love the Codex, by the way. I don't think the Codex itself is broken at all. I do think there's going to be some really powerful lists being built out of it, though. I can already see the recon detachment being extremely competitive. The combined arms detachment looks just as good with all the lethal hits. And, I mean, consider a unit of these guys in the combined arms detachment. On top of throwing out a bunch of mortal wounds, they're also throwing out a good number of lethal hits, right? Even at 65 points, this unit will out-trade and out-battle and out-secondary a lot of secondary specialists in the game. Units like Mandrakes that are more expensive are going to be nothing compared to Krieg Combat Engineers. Units like Scouts are all of a sudden not looking that durable when you could have a Krieg Combat Engineer with a 2+ save and perhaps even -1 to hit, because these guys also have the smoke stratagem, by the way. Not that you would want to spend all that CP on these guys to keep them alive, but it's an option that they have, right? Now, I think these guys, their only weakness is in melee, right? They have decent melee weapons. They have strength 4 AP0 melee weapons. They're okay, but they're not great, right? So I think that's probably their one weakness. Engage them in melee. But even so, they're going to be trading up considerably if they do get the drop on you with that remote mine. And with the free grenade strat, they can easily, for 0 CP, deal a significant chunk to your vehicles, your monsters, your characters, your expensive units, etc. There's no way that a secondary specialist unit should also be able to do this much damage. And I think that's really why they're kind of broken. I think the mine is a little bit overtuned. I think instead of dealing mortal wounds, it should have just dealt damage like any other ranged weapon, right? Like if you look at the Tempestus Achillans, they have the ability to shoot the servo weapon. The servo weapon doesn't actually deal mortal wounds, it just shoots, right? I think that even though this is a mine, it should be treated as something like a grenade launcher, right? Even if it has a good AP value, it should at least allow for invul saves, and it should have to roll more than a 3 plus, right? You have to roll a 3 plus, but it's just a little bit too powerful, I think, for what this unit should be able to do. And again, even if they increase the cost to 65 points, I think it's going to be one of those units that unfortunately is just a little bit too strong and will be one of those auto includes. So, yeah, Krieg Combat Engineers, I think just pointing out the problem in balance with secondary units, most of the secondary objective units in the game have found a really good balance. There's some that are better than others, obviously, but I think for the most part, they're pretty close in power. They do the same exact thing for every army. And I think this is the one army that their secondary objective unit just doesn't follow the regular rules, right? And I think that in general, every secondary specialist unit should follow about the same rules. Yes, they can have higher damage in general, but they're going to have to pay more points for it, right? And a good example of this actually is Swooping Hawks. Swooping Hawks are a 85 point unit now because they have lethal hits. And lethal hits is a very powerful ability. So when you have something like lethal hits, you're going to be more expensive because you can start dual rolling into other stuff. Swooping Hawks can now all of a sudden start to kill light infantry pretty effectively and also put damage on tougher targets because of those lethal hits. They don't have any AP, but they can force saves. And I think because Guard have a detachment with lethal hits built in, they have a detachment that can give you a bunch of armor and reactive moves and stuff like that, that, you know, this type of unit is just going to be a little bit oppressive for those first couple of turns of the game, right? When you're really just trying to skirmish and things like that. Krieg Combat Engineers can just walk up to a vehicle, punch 8 damage into it, and just basically almost kill it by themselves. I think that's kind of ridiculous for their cost. Even at a 65 point level, which is going to be probably what they're going to be increased to, I think it's a little bit too much. But anyway, that's just me. That's my quick rant about it. And we will, of course, move on. Okay, so lastly, let's talk about what secondary specialists across the game should cost at the baseline level and the justification for that cost. So at the bare minimum, and again, I think GW's done a pretty good job at this for the most part in Pariah Nexus. At the bare minimum, I think these units should cost 50 points and be upwards to 90 points depending on how easily they can perform their roles, which of course depends on which objectives they can easily score on turns 1 and 2 without being stopped. So more fragile secondary units that can be stopped by things like Overwatch and screening should be a bit cheaper to account for the risk and to account for your opponent's ability to prevent them from scoring those objectives, right? Good example is Rangers. Rangers can be stopped by screens, right? Rangers can be stopped by Overwatch. So yeah, Rangers should be cheap, and they're also not great at dealing damage. However, more durable units, or units with a higher damage ceiling that can kind of dual roll, should be more expensive due to their ability to weather enemy fire, like enemy Overwatch and things like that, and deal damage again, like I said, in the case that you don't draw action-based secondaries. Also remember that when it comes to the points, and if you're thinking to yourself, why would I spend 10 to 20% of my army on stuff that's just going to score secondaries? Remember that on average, 2 secondary specialist units will score you about 10% of your total victory points in the first couple turns. Under no circumstances should I think that they can cost less than 10% of your army's cost, right? If you are scoring 10% of your total victory points with those 2 units, there's no way that those 2 units should be less than 10% of your army's total cost, right? They should be at least 200 points for a couple of units, right? Sometimes less. It just depends on the situation, right? Like Rangers, for example, can be stopped by things like Overwatch and screening, so are cheaper as a result. Mandrakes, kind of the same thing. But a unit that can do a lot of damage, is durable, can score secondary objectives, that unit should not be, less than 10% of your army's total cost. And, honestly, in most cases, and when I say that unit, I'm really talking about, 2 or 3 specialist units that you're going to use at the minimum, right? In most cases, they should be slightly more also, because remember, they have the ability to deal damage and draw enemy fire, which does allow you to make better trades as well. So, in general, when you're talking about secondary specialist units, you probably should be spending about 20% of your total points on them. So, for example, it'd be about 400 points in secondary scoring for a 2,000 point army. At minimum, maybe 200 points, which is about 10% of the army's cost, should be spent on secondary objective scoring. And they will probably score you about 10%, sometimes a little bit more than 10%, just again, depends what you draw in the first couple turns. But on average, about 10% of your total victory points should be scored by these specialists. Okay, so now that I've kind of talked about the secondary specialists units, I want to kind of go into something else really quick to end the video. And that is when you're also talking about building an army, right? You need to make sure that you have things that can score you points each and every turn of the game. And when or where you use your secondary objective units should be determined on whether or not you draw the specific cards needed. So what I see some players do with units like Rangers is if they draw their secondaries, if they go first, right, and they draw their secondaries and the Rangers can't score their secondaries, I sometimes see people using them to just screen. Or not even screen, but they just kind of sit them out there in the middle of the battlefield and wait around. Rangers should be used just as any other unit in your army. You have to protect them against things that are going to be able to shoot them off the board turn one, and also things that are going to be able to charge them, right? You want to put them in a position where they have a fighting chance to survive if your opponent gets the first turn. So if you infiltrate up the board, infiltrate behind a wall, right? Position them in such a way that they can score several different objectives, but also be kind of protected against shooting and assault. You're not always going to be able to protect them, but in the cases that you aren't able to protect them, at least put them in a position where your opponent has to reveal a more expensive unit in order to kill them, right? So if your opponent's playing Blood Angels, for example, and you have your Rangers, yeah, they're not going to do a great job screening for you, so at least put your Rangers in a position to where if your opponent charges them, they're going to reveal your unit. So a 55-point unit of Rangers gets charged by an 85-point unit or 90-point unit of Assault Intercessors, right? The jump pack ones, right? Jump Assault Intercessors. That's a great trade for you because even though you're losing the Rangers, you're going to be able to trade up against the Intercessors. So even though you weren't able to score a secondary objective with that unit, you can still have that unit perform some sort of value for you, right? So that's what I'll end off on. Just secondary specialist units are extremely, well, not difficult to use, but they're extremely hard to wrap your head around when you're starting the game. And what you have to know is that you have to treat them exactly the same way. And in fact, they're a lot more technical as well than just pure damage dealing units. You do have to use them with a little bit of tact. And just like any army out there, and I'm even talking about, orc armies, whatever, right? Orc armies, they may seem like they just want to charge at you, but a good orc player is actually a very tactical one and uses a lot of strategy in mind when playing that faction. And I know this because I've played against good orc players, and I've played against the WoW orc players who, just are there for the WoW, right? There's a big difference between them, trust me. and you want to make sure that you get the most out of every single unit in your army. And it just depends on what you're fighting against too. You have to know your enemy, know what your enemy can do, know what your weaknesses are as far as your own secondary scoring units, what they can and can't do, and you'll often have a lot more success with them than just using them the same way every single game. Alrighty, maybe that's a topic for another video though. I will leave it at that for today. Thank you so much for watching. I'm using some kind of new, well, I'm using some new settings for my recording, and I plan to get, a new microphone perhaps within the next couple weeks. So maybe the quality of the recordings will go up a little bit. Just let me know what you think about the quality of this recording today. And hopefully it's better than the last couple of months that I've been kind of, using this new headset, because it's, kind of been bad. I'll admit it. I've listened back to them and the quality is not where it should be. So anyway. Alright guys, thank you once again for watching. Thank you to all my patrons and supporters who have supported the channel over the last couple years. Your help has really, really been appreciated, and it's helped the channel grow and improve so much. So thank you. If you do want to join the channel and become a patron, I have free trials activated, which will grant you permanent access to our Discord community, where you can talk with Eldar enthusiasts like me and players about strategies, tactics, and of course hobbying. We even have a pretty good tabletop simulator meetup for Eldari players who are learning faction, so you can kind of get some practice in with them before your real games at the store. Also, I'm an Amazon affiliate, and I do have a channel store page. So guys, it's your last chance to grab that Eldar Combat Patrol. It's still on Amazon. It's still 120 something bucks. It's a good deal for now. It's not going to be a good deal in 4 months or 2 months from now when the Codex comes out and the Combat Patrol is nowhere to be seen, right? You guys know what happens. You guys know what happened with the Start Collecting set. You can barely find a Start Collecting set now for under $160 out there, even on eBay. The same thing will happen to the Combat Patrol, so grab it while you can. As far as the Amazon affiliate link goes, just click on that link. I have the Combat Patrol in, my one of my lists, and that will help the channel, as well as, obviously won't be of any extra charge to you. I also have a channel store page where I sell for the channel Eldar inspired apparel. You will be able to, have your favorite rune, aspect rune, craft world rune. There's a couple of things on there that you might like. So check it out if you're an Eldar enthusiast who loves repping their favorite faction at the local game store. And yeah. Alright guys, that's going to be it for today. I'll see you guys later, and peace out. Have a good one, everybody. See you later.